everyone. Welcome back to ESG Decoded podcast. I'm Amanda Hsieh, and today I'm delighted to have Dr. Daryl Collins with me today. She's the founder and CEO of Decodis, a social research firm. She's also the author of the acclaimed Portfolios of the Poor and a pioneer in the Financial Diaries method. Daryl, thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you, Amanda. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation about how can we measure the S of ESG. This is, I think, especially relevant for a lot of our listeners and friends who work with social investment, with CSR initiatives, and or impact investors. So I'm really excited to have you on the podcast to learn more about Decodis and your work there. Will you start by telling us a little bit about your company and what you do?
Yes, well, Decodis, you can hear in the name, there's a bit of decode, which we mean that as decoding words and how people talk and what they're saying, and therefore how they feel about what they're saying. And that's a big part of our methodology. The end is dis, which is discourse. So we're really all about decoding discourse. And one of the ways that we use our decoding skills is through tech-led listening. So we use technology to create a more agile, inexpensive, and powerful way of listening to those who are less able to have their voices heard, which is vulnerable and low-income people around the world. And so, for example, we use this methodology to measure impact of social impact companies and social programs, to speak directly to the beneficiaries of these companies and programs, and to sort of ground truth, what they are feeling in terms of impact. And because it's inexpensive and agile, it means that we can measure this ground truth on a continuous basis. And that makes us track what impact is, rather than measure it once and consider impact established in any way. Impact is a journey, and so we need to follow that journey. And so that's a lot of what we do. We put all of our efforts into that one particular job.
I think for people who may be new to this space, may not understand how difficult it can be to track impact. It's easy to perhaps track how many dollars were donated, or maybe how many backpacks or students we see in a classroom, but that's not necessarily the full impact of a project, of a program, of an initiative.
I would agree. It isn't the full impact. One of the ways we've tracked impact, maybe easier ways, although it's still quite difficult, is by scale and number of people impacted, or number of types of distributions. But we don't know the reaction of the people who are the recipients and the beneficiaries on the other side. And one of the important things about that is that we need to know how they used what we're providing to them. And the reason why that's important is because it may be completely different to what we think it is. Sometimes we may wonder if there really is an impact. We wonder what happens beyond our intervention. And we can uncover that. And in some ways, that can be very reassuring. It's not only about holding that company or that institution accountable for providing impact, it's also for informing the company about what type of impact they're having, so that they can think about how to target that impact and increase it. There could be small tweaks that they can do with their business model to make that impact more powerful.
I wonder in if there's ever been a case where the impact was perhaps different than what was originally planned. And I could see how having these deeper insights could help a program and organization adjust based on what they're hearing or what Decodis is hearing.
Yes, that's actually the idea, is that we're trying to create a sense of an impact model for social entrepreneurs. And you can't really have a sense of what impact you're having until you really understand. For example, we worked with a low cost internet service provider in India. And the idea of that company was to sort of bring the internet to low income people at a lower cost. When we interviewed those customers, we found that a lot of them were using the internet, but they were using mobile data. And mobile data meant that you'd have your service cut quite often. It wasn't continuous. So we found that it was quite important that the service was lower cost, but that wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was the continuity. So, for example, if you think of how many kids during COVID have been doing online classes, if it's hard enough to get a kid to engage in online classes on camera, if that line is constantly dropping, then forget it. You're going to lose their attention at every drop. The other thing that we found in terms of the impact of this continuous internet that they were providing was that business owners could now engage in a lot more advertising platforms and marketplace platforms. They could put their products on platforms. They were able to do payments more easily. If you're doing some sort of payment off mobile data, you're terrified that suddenly it's going to drop in the middle of the payment and then you don't know if the payment's gone through. So interestingly, I'm a person who comes from a background in financial inclusion, and it never occurred to me that having internet rather than, or Wi-Fi instead of mobile data was key to having people feel more comfortable and easy about payments and online banking and what have you. So this company actually made a huge difference in small businesses. Now, one of the ways that that might impact them for the future is that they may think, for example, of having some sort of association with a small business group and offering their product through that group. And in that way, if they have more small businesses as a segment within their sample, and they can target those small businesses, then they're really enhancing their impact. Because for these small businesses, it made a major difference. And people talked about how much more money they were able to make. And any increase in income is always impactful to a low-income family.
I think so. So many of us, we have a theory of change that we try to document out. If we do this, and then we think this is what's going to happen. And I think what's interesting is this can help validate and that theory of change and help us see what the real impacts are, so we can try to, again, as you mentioned before, tweak it, adjust it to really optimize our impact, the intended impact we're wanting. I was thinking about something that you said when you said tech-led listening. And at the same time, in some areas of the world, as you were just in your example that you gave, maybe they don't have Wi-Fi, continuous Wi-Fi. Perhaps it is just mobile. Can you tell us a little bit more about, I love this idea of tech-led listening. How does that operate if you don't have, let's say, continuous Wi-Fi?
I mean, what you really need is a phone line and a phone, even a basic phone, not a smartphone. You just need connectivity. Tech-led listening is interesting in that you've got tech-led, which feels very, it's technical. It's sort of a hard science, if you will. And then listening is, we're a lot more anthropological, we're dealing with more humanities types of subjects, and we're putting those two together. So it feels a bit like two things that shouldn't be combined, yet they are. So what we do with the tech is we use interactive voice recording to interview beneficiaries of programs and companies. And what we're looking for is for them to just talk to the questions that we have. The other thing that we do, which is interesting, especially for a low-income person who, might not have that much agency and doesn't get a chance to talk, and sometimes doesn't get a chance to talk about things like, if they're a small business owner, how did you start your business? What do you want to think about next? What are your ambitions? And when you hear people answer those types of questions, you can tell that they need to think. The way that we encourage those types of real reflection is we use voice actors who not only ask questions in the respondent's own language, and we deal with languages all over the world. We're doing surveys in Hausa from Nigeria and Twi in Ghana, and certainly Hindi and Tamil and Xhosa in South Africa. So we're not only speaking in somebody's own language, but we're also using voice actors that will speak in a very friendly way. And we're using voice actors that are the same gender and maybe even roughly the same age. And so we're trying to make that conversation equal. And we find that when beneficiaries answer the questions from a voice actor who is signaling to them, answer in your own language. We're going to have this conversation in your home language. You talk, and I'll just listen. Then beneficiaries tend to be very articulate, very happy to have been asked some of these questions. And we're essentially providing an experience of interview where the beneficiary feels consulted, not studied and put under a microscope. And that's really important. It means that the impact measurement becomes impactful in and of itself, because you're taking someone who typically doesn't have much of a voice, and you're giving them not only a voice, but you're encouraging them to speak very much as themselves, as if they're talking to themselves. So that's, again, taking this interactive voice recording, which is it's a tech tool, but we're making it very approachable. We're thinking about who is this voice actor asking the questions in order to make that conversation as natural and consultative as possible, because that gets us better quality data. So, a good example, we're about to do some surveys in Nigeria of smallholder farmers. And we need to ask things about recalling specific incidences around climate change. And they're very detailed questions. And one way that we thought about having the voice actor ask is to say, I'm not a farmer. Can you explain to me exactly how you manage your cassava crop? When do you plant? When do you explain to me? So that we get all that rich detail that we really want, that tells us something about how this farmer experienced climate change. So who they're talking to is incredibly important to get that richness and to get honesty and to get all the muddiness of somebody's life. But then what we do is we bring the tech back in. We take all this rich, wonderful voice data and we use automated speech to text, and that becomes a transcript of what somebody said. And we sometimes do samples of up to 1,000 beneficiaries. So lots and lots and lots of voice data, lots of these transcripts. And we can be asking 50 questions at a time or in different times. So you get this massive amount of data. How on earth can you manage to analyze all those words? We use natural language processing, and that helps us draw out what we know to be particularly important phrases that really mean something. So a good example is when we asked women in Paraguay about how they felt about their partners looking at their phones. We found that women answered in two different ways. They said, well, we look at each other's phones. I let him look at my phone so that I can look at his. And in that way, we build trust. Other women said, no, we trust each other. We don't need to look at each other's phones. And that tells you two completely different things about gender norms. We have natural language processing code that draws those things out, which are particularly important for social science. And then we also listen to the voice, because if somebody's talking in a voice that sounds very reserved and they're a bit depressed about what they're saying, you'll say, gosh, that's a completely different emotion than I imagined in my head when I read that phrase that they were saying. Or if you can tell that they're really leaning in and they feel very passionate about what they're saying, say, wow, okay, this person really believes it. And it helps us detect important things like when people are telling you something that they think that you want to hear. That's always death in social research. When somebody says, oh, let me just get out of this interview, this is tiring. Let me just give you let me think if I can, okay, you're asking me about this, and so I'm just going to tell you that. And that's not a real answer. We've got to toss that aside. So that's where we, again, bring in the tech, but we bring it in a very acute, socially sensitive way. But because we do it in a way that we can draw up into something like a social impact index. And that's very helpful to get back to sort of the hard numbers that you can put against the equally hard numbers of a balance sheet and a profit and loss statement.
Well, I was just thinking that number one, that was just a master class in doing how to conduct a real interview, for any relative, whether you're using the technology or not to assist or our process. But that's so interesting. I think that we're able to not only analyze the words, but also the emotions behind it. Because as humans, right, I think I've read studies where what we say is a rather small percentage, but how we say it, our body language, is actually a much bigger percentage of how we communicate with each other as a species. So it's interesting to hear that technology can help even pick out those nuances. And then you mentioned at the end, there is a way to quantify it, to turn it into an index. I think a social impact index, I think you describe it.
Right.
So that it, again, getting back down to the kind of the numbers and analysis of it all to help make decisions, really, of these thousands of interviews.
And you can set targets, and a portfolio company can have a conversation with their investor, and that conversation can be similar about target setting in the business. There can also be target setting about social impact. How are we going to increase our social impact? What triggers and levers are we going to use? Are we going to go after the most impactful segment? Are we going to take an aspect of social impact and we're going to really enhance it? And it's a conversation about tweaking social impact without disturbing the business model, without saying, oh, you need to do something completely different. But it's a journey of increasing social impact little by little, which is really how it happens. We know that, for example, poverty does not usually change overnight. We know that it's it can often be generational. And in this way, this type of agile social impact measurement is appropriate for companies because it allows them to measure in a consistent way year to year and allows them to keep track of where they're going and do small course corrections that might enhance impact over time, and to know where they're going, and to be able to have a conversation internally. You can get the whole team on board and say, this is the impact we're having, everybody. It is real. And here's our plans to increase it in the next year. Here's our target. How are we going to do that target alongside the business target? And they can be synonymous. They can be self-reinforcing. Any customer that you provide impact to is a customer for life. So impact and business don't need to go against each other in terms of the type of social impact companies that I deal with. Usually they do go hand in hand.
I'm also thinking that having this type of measurable impact can also help companies on the risk management side. A lot of times we have a theory of change. We have good intentions. We think it's going to do this.
Yeah.
And being able to measure that can say, yes, it was achieving this, and we can tweak this a little bit more. Or we can say, oh, we're actually seeing some unintended consequences here. How do we adapt and change? Again, but without having this information from thousands of hundreds of beneficiary really from themselves, how do you know until it's until it's too late or whatever it is. So I think this is fascinating.
Exactly. Going back to the Wi-Fi company in India, you can imagine if people are on continuous internet, then they're kids are on games more. Inappropriate content might come to them. You might get more cybersecurity risks. Now, we found in this initial survey with them that a few folks were worried about it, but there wasn't a lot of experience. But surely that's going to become more of an experience. So right now, this company is really expanding very, very quickly. And they can't think of everything at once. They're in a massive growth phase, and they want to make sure if their value is continuity, they have to make sure that they're providing continuity. But they need to start thinking about how to help their clients protect themselves from cybersecurity risks. And this helps them time when they really need to lean into that potential negative externality. It helps them make choices about what they work on. I mean, most of the time, social entrepreneurs are just that. It's a small company, almost always resource stretched. You can't do everything all at once. So it helps you make choices. And by measuring, it does help you say, okay, we're seeing a risk coming up, and we don't want that unintended consequence. But now is a time that we're going to be able to invest in that. Whereas when we were first expanding, we would have had a hard time doing that.
Daryl, thank you so much for being my guest today and sharing all this. I mean, again, whether or not our listeners are into the technology part or not, just how do we measure impact in a way that's accurate, and how do we conduct interviews that's really consulting our beneficiaries? It's so impactful. And of course, we'll put the Decodis website in the show notes. So if anyone really wants to learn more about Decodis and get in contact with Dr. Daryl Collins, will be an easy link for there. Thank you so much.